Weeping Willow Cottage by Natasha J. Rosewood, Part 1. When I look back on that time, I realize that, although I thought I had chosen Weeping Willow Cottage, I was wrong. The house had chosen me. Just 1 year earlier, I had returned from a 10-month adventure traveling around Europe with my now ex-boyfriend, Tom. We had been sitting in our blue and white VW camper at the northernmost tip of Finland, sipping instant coffee and munching on digestive biscuits, when he told me that he didn't want to marry me. As if my parents' abuse wasn't enough, they had made sure that no man would want me either. I was officially unlovable. Crying all the way through Sweden and Norway, I had finally acknowledged, by the time we got off the ferry at Dover, that Tom and I really wouldn't be settling down together. I decided, miserable or not, I would buy my own home. And so there I was, a year later, 25 years old, and a special events coordinator for a large hotel near Heathrow Airport, standing in the entrance of Weeping Willow, the last 400-year-old cottage within my price range. From the outside, the cottage was deceptively small. The single oak front door opened into a low-ceilinged vestibule that led to a spacious living room. On the left was a square, modernized kitchen. At the top of the spiral wooden staircase, I discovered one large and two medium-sized bedrooms off a small landing. As I strolled through a light-filled dining room to the back of the house and into a budding garden where a weeping willow dominated the small patch of grass, I felt that this cottage, tucked away in a cosy corner of Haddon, Buckinghamshire, was meant to be mine. My friends Julie and Di, who had come with me, cooed at the large fireplace and the coziness of the rooms. Despite the fact that the cottage needed major renovations, as in leveling the floor in the large bedroom and installing central heating, 2 months later we, Di, Julie and I, moved in. Just the three of us, or so we thought. The date was March 13th, 1976. Diane and Julie were air stewardesses based at Heathrow, working for an airline that took them all over the world, while I slogged away at the hotel nearby. For me, summer months were about dealing with muggy London heat and dense traffic jams, while accomplishing highly stressful organizational feats and using my various languages on multinational tourists. So there wasn't much time to pay attention to the pesky idiosyncrasies of my new home. One night, ensconced in my large bedroom, I was drifting off to sleep when I thought I heard a noise. Both Julie and Di were away, and the house was otherwise silent. Sounds like someone is breathing, I thought. Yes, it was definitely deep breathing, heavy and rasping, as if a man was in my room. I sat up in bed and listened. Was it emanating from the wall near the closet, or was the heavy breathing in the closet? The sound, though coming from that side of the room, was difficult to place. Maybe it's something else, I thought. How could breathing be coming from the closet? Unless I didn't want to think about the possibility of a ghost. I decided I must be imagining things, or perhaps it was some strange noise from the house itself. The pipes, maybe. Eventually exhausted, I succumbed to sleep. When the heavy breathing started up again the next night, and the next, I decided the noise must be something to do with the water tank on the tiny landing. I could live with that. Then Di returned from Dubai. "Bloody hell, Sam," she exclaimed the next morning in her pronounced northern accent. "When did you start snoring? You're loud enough to wake the bloody dead." "You can hear it too?" I asked, alarmed. "Nice try," she laughed. "Trying to blame it on something else, are you? Or have you got a man stashed in your room?" "Ha ha," I responded dryly. Since Tom and I had broken up, my life was devoid of men and romance. "There's something in my room, but trust me, it's not a live man. I want you to come to my room and listen to it." Di knew I wasn't kidding now. "It's giving me the creeps," I continued, "but the noise only starts later on, around 11 o'clock. "Sounds like it's coming from within the closet near the floor," Di said later, as she sat on my bedroom chair listening, "like an older man in a deep sleep." I slumped down on the bed. Great, I had bought a haunted house. "Maybe the previous owner knows somewhat about it," Di suggested. "You should give her a ring." I took Di's advice the following week and called Wendy. "Breathing? No, I never heard any breathing." She sounded distracted, unwilling to be called back into her previous life. "There were some other noises, scraping sounds." I held my breath, feeling somewhat vindicated. "But I decided they were coming from next door." "Oh," I murmured, disappointed. "Scraping sounds?" Like me, Wendy obviously preferred to believe that the breathing wasn't something supernatural. I knew that whatever the sounds were, they were not coming from the adjoining cottage. My neighbours were a newly married couple, Anglo-American couple. The walls were thick between the two cottages, and the only sound I ever heard from next door was the occasional peal of laughter from the Texan wife. So I learned to live with the breathing. 6 months later, just as I was getting used to it, the nocturnal noise suddenly stopped. Shortly afterwards, I awoke in the middle of the night. A dream had left me with a gnawing unease that something terrible was about to happen. I tried to recall the details, but the disturbing images had already retreated into my subconscious. In September, Julie's husband-to-be returned from overseas, and she left Di and me to get married. Derek, a 26-year-old pharmaceutical salesman from Hampshire, moved into her room. His penchant for wearing pinstripe suits and peering out into the world through huge glasses that overwhelmed his slim face always struck me as slightly comical. We got on famously. One night, after Derek had gallantly assisted me in painting over the orange walls of the living room with 2 layers of cream latex, we sat by the glow of the fire, rewarding ourselves with a bottle of wine and admiring our handiwork. "Good job," I commented, smiling, "but you've got more paint on you and your glasses than on the walls." Derek grunted and reached for a clean rag. While picking the paint smears off the lenses, he said, "I've been meaning to tell you something," he said, his country accent even stronger after imbibing wine. "Is that right, my dear?" I teased. "Aye." He wasn't smiling. "Getting married?" "Nah," he grinned bashfully. "Not bloody likely, my love." Normally I bristled at being addressed as dear or love, but the way Derek said "my dear" was somehow, well, endearing. I breathed a sigh of relief. "Well, what is it?" "I hate to tell you, but I think there's a ghost in this house." He sat back and exhaled as if relieved of his burden. "You mean haunted?" I repeated a little too sardonically. Di and I had not spoken of the breathing since the noise had stopped, and we definitely hadn't mentioned it to Derek. "What makes you say that?" He took a sip of wine, the orange glow from the fire reflected on his cleaned glasses. "One day, I were alone in the house. You and I were away somewhere. Well, you know how hard you have to pull on the airing cupboard door. It doesn't open by itself like, and when it opens, you can't get past the door into the bathroom." I nodded. That door always caught on a rock in the carpet. Another thing to fix. "Well, when I went into the bathroom, the airing cupboard door were closed shut. I had me shower, and when I came out, I went smack bang into airing cupboard door." Derek clapped his hands together for emphasis. I struggled to keep a straight face. Whenever he was serious, I always felt an urge to giggle. Or maybe I was nervous. "If there was nobody in the house, you tell me how did that door open?" "Is that it?" I asked. "No." He sat up in his chair, warming to the topic. "Sometimes my bedroom door suddenly swings wide open, like somebody's mad. I expect to see you standing there, but there's nobody." I took a sip of wine. I didn't have an answer. Why would it occur to Derek that I would be mad at him? But that wasn't important now. If this was true, if the place was haunted, what was I supposed to do? Sell the house? I could just see the real estate sign on the lawn with a large "Haunted" sticker slapped across the red and blue lettering. "But it feels so peaceful here," I reassured Derek. I didn't want to lose him. He was such a wonderful tenant, and he was fast becoming a good friend. "Why, that's true," he nodded. "Maybe the ghost just doesn't like men." Maybe. I continued to believe that if I didn't pay any attention to the ghost, it would go away. I dreaded Christmas. Capital Radio was already counting down shopping days like a ticking time bomb. Volunteering to work every day of the holiday was an option. To come home to an empty house, devoid of celebrating relatives and the smell of turkey, I knew would be too lonely. So while my intuition was screaming at me to avoid spending Christmas with my mother, I didn't listen. Instead of gathering at Weeping Willow as I had proposed, my older sister insisted that we go to her house up north for the holiday. Anyone who drove up the M1, a motorway that stretched from London to Manchester with kamikaze drivers careening at 100 miles an hour in dense fog, often causing deadly pile-ups, knew it was a dice with death, even with a good driver. And my mother's driving, even when she was sober, was erratic. As tactfully as possible, I offered to drive, but as usual her dominance prevailed. On that foggy Christmas Eve in cold and rainy weather, with my mother at the wheel of her aging white Fiat, Grandy, my beloved 78-year-old grandmother, sat in the front while I silently prayed in the back. In the shadows, occasionally illuminated by the yellow, flickering lights of oncoming cars, I could see the strain in Grandy's face. We sat hunched and still, while my mother barely negotiated the perilous crowded motorway, until the car broke down in the rain just north of London. My mother was able to coax the squeaking Fiat along the motorway's narrow hard shoulder to the next surface station at Watford. While we waited in the starkly illuminated motorway cafeteria for the fen belt to be replaced, my mother, not so surreptitiously, produced from her coat pocket a bottle of Schweppes tonic water. "To calm her nerves," she said. Grandy and I exchanged worried glances, realizing that the bottle, no doubt, contained a large ratio of gin. Later, after an additional 3 harrowing hours of her inebriated and neurotic driving, when we finally drove into the grey, drizzly bleakness of Preston, our nerves were shredded. Was it the dark, small industrial town, with its depressing rows and rows of blackened terraced houses, the myriad of unhappy childhood memories that surfaced, or simply the permeating drizzle that dampened my spirit? The sense of dread was in my bones. I shivered. As we entered my sister's festively decorated house, Jean and her normally stoic husband George were in the throes of a fight. After our perilous journey, before we were even offered tea, Jean stormed out of the house, while George escaped to his office. Giving up on her miserable family, Grandy retreated to bed, leaving me alone with my gin and tonic sodden mother. From her chair in the shadowed corner, her eyes glinted with malice. I knew what was coming. Soon I was sitting frozen on the couch, incapable of moving, while she threw verbal knives into me, her vicious words devastating what was left of my meagre self-esteem. She snarled and spat her rage at me, her rage at everything, the husband who had betrayed her, her rotten childhood, her 4 selfish children who had allegedly abandoned her, the Christmases that would never be again. All of it was somehow my fault. With my schizophrenic mother, I always felt like a mountain climber, struggling to get to the top of a mountain, yearning to see for miles, to finally understand, to exhale. Now, once again, I felt as if my lifeline had been shredded, and I was flailing, like so many times before, falling to my spiritual death. I tried feebly to move, to fight back, but I was lying at the bottom of a crevasse, broken and bleeding. The words had been said, the knives had been thrown, the blades had stabbed me where intended, then twisted to make sure they had gone deep. She was never happy until the damage was done. When the verbal blows finally subsided and I could move again, I dragged myself off the couch and walked woodenly out of the room. As I cried myself to sleep that Christmas Eve, I couldn't shake the eerie feeling that the unending nightmare of my mother was somehow an echo of the ghost in my home. Before I finally succumbed to sleep, I vowed never to spend another Christmas with my mother. Never again. One February night, 2 months later, in my own home, I had gone to bed early, hoping to catch up on some sleep. But I tossed and turned in a bad dream, attempting to break free of a vague feeling of something or somebody trying to overpower me. Now someone was shaking me by my shoulders, an urgent voice invading my nightmare. "Sam! Sam! Sam!" I struggled to fight him off, but he held me in a vice-like grip. "Leave me alone!" I sobbed. "Leave me alone!" Then I came to. I was sitting up in bed, breathing hard, sick to my stomach. The bedside light was on, and Derek, clad in his tartan dressing gown, was sitting on the side of my bed. "What are you doing here?" I asked. "Are you all right?" Concern showed through his glasses. I was embarrassed, not only because I wondered what Derek had heard, but also because he was breaching the unspoken flatmate rule, "Thou shalt not enter the bedroom of your flatmate when she is in bed." I pulled the covers up under my chin. "Yes," I murmured, brushing my long tousled hair out of my face. "Sorry, did I wake you up?" His eyes were puffy and blurry with sleep. "Yes, you did." Derek sat back now, something unsettled lurking behind his persistent gaze. "I thought somebody was trying to do you in." He smiled a little, but a question still lingered. Now my nightmare was replaying vividly in my mind. This wasn't the first time I'd experienced this nighttime horror. When I thought about it, the bad dreams were becoming a nightly occurrence. I just hadn't realized I was screaming out loud. And I wasn't ready to share the sickening images with Derek, or anyone. "I'm okay," I said, still trembling under the covers, hoping Derek would go back to his own bed. "Just a bad dream." "Well, all right then, my dear," he said, "if you say so." He stood up, started toward the door, and then turned. "Sam?" "Yes?" "If you ever want to talk about it." "Talk about what?" The pit of my stomach felt suddenly leaden. Did he know? "Your nightmares." "Oh, no, it's nothing really." "All right," he said, and left. Even though Tom and I had split up, his friends continued to visit me. One evening, his best friend John dropped by while all three flatmates, Di, Derek, and I, were enjoying a rare dinner together. Tall and slim with a shock of thick blonde hair, John was aware of his handsome locks, and he put them to good use. He usually entered a room in a whirlwind of energy, looking for fun. If none was happening, he would somehow create some drama. We invited him to have a glass of wine with us. As soon as he sat down, I saw that look in Di's eyes that said, "And who are you?" I didn't have time to introduce them. Sparks were flying, an easy flirtatious banter instantaneous between them. Derek and I adjourned to the couch, recognizing that a romance had just begun, and that we were suddenly superfluous. A little later, when John and Di had disappeared to the pub together, and Derek and I were watching television, I noticed he was deep in thought. "Penny for them," I said, smiling. "Oh, I was just thinking that you should get married." "What?" "I think it would be good for you, my dear." "Even if I did want to get married, what do you expect me to do? Just pop down to Sainsbury's and pick a husband off the shelf?" I smiled wryly. "Maybe they're on sale this week." "You know what I mean." "No, I don't, Derek. Please tell me." "Well," he said, sitting up and picking his words carefully, "it's like you've got this big wall round you, and you're so independent. You scare men away." "Well, that's good," I snapped. His words stung. I had witnessed the bitter ending to my parents' marriage, and what a man and a woman can do to destroy each other after 30 years, not to mention the abuse of their children. I don't want to get married anyway. Since Tom's rejection, I had decided marriage was not in my cards. "You say that, but you really do." He got up. "You can't fool me, Sam." Derek raised his arms high in a stretch and then moved toward the staircase. "Sweet dreams," he called over his shoulder. After Derek had gone to bed, I decided to listen to music alone in the living room, putting off the time when I would have to face sleep, perchance to dream. Derek's words were still stinging as Simon and Garfunkel's gentle tune, I am a wreck, and echoed his comments. Maybe he was right. Maybe I did want to get married. I had never seen myself as being scary, though. I was the one who was scared of being crazy like my mother, or abusive like my father. Finally exhausted, I must have dropped off. Then I became conscious of somebody gently shaking my left shoulder, as if to say, "Wake up and go to bed." I opened my eyes and glanced up, expecting to see Derek or Di, but nobody was there. And when I rose to turn off the record player, I stared at it stunned. The little red power light was already extinguished. The next night I was in bed and just dropping off to sleep when something moved in the darkness. Somebody was in my room. I couldn't see them in the shadows, but I could feel them coming closer and closer to my bed. I wanted to scream, but my body was paralyzed. I lay there helpless. Suddenly, some material was covering my face. I couldn't breathe. I struggled, twisting and squirming under the weight of the invisible force, fighting for life. Then just as suddenly the pressure was lifted. The thing was gone, and I was sitting up in bed awake, sobbing and gasping for breath. The landing light went on, and there was a gentle tap, tap, tap on my bedroom door. Derek appeared, silhouetted in the lighted doorway. "There's another nightmare?" I nodded, not looking up. He came over, sat beside my hunched form on the bed, and listened to me cry. After a while he put a tentative, comforting hand on my bare shoulder. "I know it's none of my business, Chuck, but I think you should go and talk to somebody about these nightmares. I mean, it's not like they're going away, is it?" "You mean a psychiatrist?" I snarled, echoes of my mother's sarcasm in my voice. "Crazy people go to see psychiatrists." "Well, somebody that can help you. Maybe it's the job. Maybe you just need a bit of a break, like, I don't know, but I will tell you something." "What's that?" I turned to face Derek. His face was soft in the shadows. "If you won't go and talk to a doctor, you'll have to talk to me, 'cause I need me bloody sleep too, you know." I smiled then. Okay, you're right. But of course I didn't go for help. In the spring of 1977, tired of hearing Di talk about all her wonderful trips, I finally took the plunge and applied to British Airways for a job as a stewardess. I knew BA's flights were 90% long haul, with stopovers all over the world. To my complete surprise, I was hired, and that's how I met David. Apparently it didn't happen very often, a passenger asking a stewardess out on a date. So when the jumbo lumbered into Heathrow Airport on its final descent from LA, and the tall blonde-haired passenger who had been flirting with me the whole flight, not so surreptitiously, suddenly asked if he could call me, I blushed profusely and stammered, "Yes." He gave me his card and told me his name was David Spencer. The phone rang 3 days later. David was dynamic, a little shy, very intelligent, and lots of fun. His family owned a farm just 10 miles away, and they had founded an international sports business based in London. He opened up my world to a multitude of small surprises. Life was suddenly wonderful. I was in love. Most of the marriage-minded girls I flew with were looking for tall, dark, handsome, and rich. But when I found out that David's family actually did have old money, lots of it, the information intimidated me. And the fact that he went hunting with lords and his friends lived in mansions, while my friends and I lived in semi-detached houses and dilapidated cottages, didn't help. Whenever we began to get close, maybe because of these differences in our status, some nameless monster in me would rise up, snarling, and scare him away. I don't know where the monster came from. I had no control over it. The monster did its job well. I wouldn't see David for weeks. Then I would apologize. We would reunite and begin the dance all over again. The closer we became, and the happier I felt, the more ferocious the monster was. David's absences were longer, and my apologies more profuse. My suitcase was so heavy, dragging the burgundy Samsonite out of my car into the July mugginess after an exhausting 16-hour duty from Barbados was, I decided, the worst part of the whole trip. but I was happy to be home and looking forward to seeing David. I put my key in the lock, opened the front door, and jerked my luggage over the threshold. "Anybody home?" I called into the silent entrance, closing the door behind me. From upstairs I heard a click. Di's bedroom door was opening. I waited, expecting her warm, deep voice to call a greeting down the stairs. But there was just an odd stillness, and then a crash. The door that had just opened slammed shut again, almost with a vengeance. I wondered if Di was angry about something. Then I remembered she was in Mauritius, and Derek was at work. There was no one in the house. End of part 1 of Weeping Willow Cottage. Join me next week for part 2.